The giant warship of the Zurich Predator clan hung in deep space like a dark metal beast, silent on the outside but filled with chaos within. The sharp echo of alarms shook the long steel halls, turning the ship into a storm of red lights and roaring voices as warriors rushed in every direction, their powerful legs thundering across the floor. Every warrior, no matter how strong or proud, carried the same fear in their eyes as they shouted warnings and commands, because something unthinkable had happened. 3 young cubs of the clan had vanished. For the Zarak, their cubs were more precious than weapons, more sacred than honor, for they were rare, born only once every few cycles, and each one carried the hope of the clan's future. The nesting pod was supposed to be the safest place on the entire ship, guarded by thick metal doors, heat scanners, and soldiers who never left their post. Yet the cubs were gone without a single sign of struggle. No alarms had been tripped, no cameras caught an intruder, and no enemy ships appeared on the scanners. The disappearance made no sense, and that made it even more terrifying. In the center of the confusion stood Harko, the clan leader, his massive frame covered in dark armored scales and his jaw set in a hard snarl. Flames of anger burned in his eyes as he slammed a heavy fist into the steel wall, bending it inward with the force of his rage. He demanded answers from everyone, his voice echoing through the ship like thunder, and warriors scrambled to obey him. He ordered teams to search every deck, every hidden passage, every vent that a cub might squeeze into. He commanded the scout ships to scan the surrounding space, and he even summoned the spiritual keepers of the clan to check for old curses or strange energies. The Zarak were desperate, for they could not imagine life without their young. But even as Harko worked to find the cubs, an old suspicion spread through the warriors like fire through dry grass. This had to be the work of humans. Humans were the strange, unpredictable species that the Zarak never understood. They were small, weak, almost fragile-looking compared to the powerful clans of the galaxy. Yet they kept surprising everyone by surviving battles they should have lost. The Zarak viewed humans with a mixture of caution and confusion. They could not grasp how humans fought with such wild bravery or how they stayed calm even in the face of death. To the Zarak, humans were dangerous not because of their strength, but because of their strange minds and impossible ideas. And now, with the cubs missing, many warriors believed the human prisoner they kept on board might have escaped and taken the young ones as a bargaining tool. Harko tried to silence these assumptions, but even he felt a small spark of doubt. If humans were involved, then this situation was far worse than it appeared. With his claws curling tightly, he made a silent promise to the ancestors that whoever took the cubs would face a wrath greater than any storm. As the alarms continued to scream through the ship, and warriors searched with growing fear in their hearts, the truth was still hidden far from them. The Zarak believed they were in the middle of a kidnapping crisis. They believed their future had been stolen. They believed the cubs were in the hands of an enemy. They did not know how wrong and how surprised they would soon be. Deep inside the enormous Zarak warship, far from the shouting warriors and flashing alarms, a small and forgotten maintenance bay sat quiet, lit only by a few weak lamps that flickered like tired stars. In that lonely space lay Evan Cole, a human engineer who had been taken prisoner weeks earlier when the Zarak attacked the exploration ship he worked on. He was not a soldier, not a fighter, just a man who fixed broken machines and tried to stay alive in a place where everyone around him was stronger, faster, and far more dangerous. His uniform was torn at the knees, his hands were covered in oil and burns, and his eyes carried the heavy exhaustion of someone who had been pushed far beyond his limit. The Zarak had put him to work repairing damaged systems, and because he was the only human on the ship, he received no help and no kindness, only cold orders and sharp glares. But even with no trust from the warriors, Evan had saved the ship from an engine meltdown twice already, and despite their pride, the Zarak grudgingly knew he was useful. After nearly 2 days of non-stop repairs, Evan finally dropped to the warm metal floor, too tired to walk back to his small cell. He closed his eyes, determined to sleep right where he collapsed. What Evan did not know was that 3 small Zara cubs had been watching him for days. They had followed him through the halls, fascinated by the strange human who talked to machines as if they were alive and muttered jokes under his breath while fixing dangerous wires. They saw the way he handled tools gently, the way he sighed when he was tired, and the soft tone he used even when he was frustrated. To the cubs who were raised among warriors with loud voices and sharp claws, Evan felt warm and calm. So when he lay down to rest, the cubs approached him quietly, their small paws tapping lightly on the metal floor. They sniffed him curiously, circled him twice, then climbed onto his chest and curled up like furry balls of heat. One pressed its tiny head under his chin, another tucked itself near his shoulder, and the smallest one settled directly on his stomach, purring like a miniature engine. Evan stirred slightly, half awake, and saw a fluffy tail brushing his face. In his tired state, he simply mumbled something about space pests and rolled onto his side, pulling the cubs closer without realizing it. Within seconds, he was fast asleep again, surrounded by 3 little creatures who trusted him completely. While he slept, a small maintenance cam hanging from the ceiling blinked awake, scanning the room. It captured everything: Evan lying peacefully on the floor, the cubs resting on top of him like babies on their parent, their tiny claws gripping his shirt gently. The feed went straight to the bridge, where dozens of Zurak warriors stared at the image in complete disbelief. Cub caretaker guards gasped loudly. Hunters dropped their weapons in shock. No one could understand why their cubs, who usually bit and scratched everything around them, were cuddled so closely against a human. Herco himself leaned in, his mandibles twitching as he replayed the footage twice, unable to make sense of it. The room filled with confused murmurs. Some whispered that the human must have tricked them. Others wondered if the cubs were sick. But deep down, a strange and uncomfortable truth formed in everyone's mind. The cubs were not frightened, not harmed, not stolen. They were simply sleeping, trusting the human as though he were part of their family. Yet before anyone could act, the ship shuddered violently, and the warning klaxons roared again. An enemy fleet had arrived, and war was about to begin, with a human engineer and 3 sleeping cubs caught in the middle of a storm no one expected. Evan woke slowly to the strange feeling of many eyes watching him, and as his vision cleared, he realized he was lying in the middle of the maintenance bay with at least 50 heavily armed Zarak warriors surrounding him. Their sharp spears pointed at his chest and their armor glowing faintly under the red emergency lights. For a moment he froze, wondering if he was dreaming or about to die, until he felt a warm weight on his stomach and looked down to see the 3 Zarak cubs still curled peacefully on him, sleeping as if nothing in the world could bother them. He sighed softly, understanding instantly why the warriors looked ready to tear him apart. Herco, the clan leader, stepped forward with slow, heavy movements that made the floor tremble. His shadow fell over Evan like a mountain, and his voice came out in a deep growl that shook the air as he demanded an explanation. Evan raised both hands in the air, careful not to disturb the cubs, and tried to speak calmly even though his heart pounded in his throat. He explained that he did not take the cubs, he did not lure them, he did not even know they were with him until he woke up. He told them he was too exhausted to notice anything, and that the cubs must have simply followed him because they were curious. Some warriors hissed at his words, but their anger faded when one cub yawned widely, showing tiny sharp teeth before nuzzling against Evan's chin like a child seeking comfort. The room went silent. Zara cubs were wild by nature, always biting, climbing, wrestling, and showing their strength even as infants, yet with the human they acted soft, gentle, and strangely affectionate. Herco stared long and hard at the scene, confused by something he had never witnessed in all his long years. He wondered if this human, this small and fragile creature, had somehow earned the cub's trust without even trying. Before he could question further, the entire warship shook violently as a huge explosion thundered through the hull, knocking weapons from hands and sending warriors stumbling. The lights flickered, alarms blared louder, and a crackling voice shouted across the ship that a massive fleet had appeared outside, an enemy known as the Croth Dominion, ancient rivals who destroyed everything they touched. The Zarak warriors rushed to action instantly, but Evan remained where he was with the cubs clinging to him in fear, their little bodies trembling each time the ship shook. He instinctively held them closer, protecting them from falling debris as a pipe burst behind him, showering sparks across the floor. Several Zarak warriors stared, seeing a human one of the weakest species shielding their young with his own body. For a moment, their distrust softened. Herco watched too, and something changed in his expression, a quiet shift in the way he saw the human before him. With the ship shaking more violently by the second, he pointed at Evan and asked if he could fix the failing systems. Evan looked around at the smoking walls, the damaged wires, and the flickering lights, then nodded, but only after asking for tools and for his chains to be removed. Herco sliced the chains with one strong strike of his blade and ordered his warriors to give Evan everything he needed. Together they ran toward the engine room, the cubs still clinging to Evan. And with each explosion, each tremor, and each second slipping away, both human and Zarak understood that survival now depended on trusting someone they never expected to rely on. The warship groaned like a wounded beast as the Croth Dominion unleashed another wave of brutal ion fire, tearing through metal plates and shaking every room from the bridge to the engine core. And as the alarm screamed and sparks rained from the ceiling, Evan ran beside the Zaraka warriors, feeling the cubs cling tightly to his chest and shoulders, trembling with each violent impact. When they reached the engine room, the air was thick with smoke and heat, and broken wires danced wildly like angry snakes. Zarak engineers shouted orders at one another, but nothing made sense because the Croth attack had damaged too many systems at once. Great panels hung loose from the walls, coolant leaked across the floor, and one of the giant energy coils was moments away from exploding. Evan pushed past the confusion, dropping to his knees near the main console as the cubs scrambled off him and hid beneath a workbench, their small eyes glowing with fear. His hands moved fast, faster than anyone expected, flipping switches, pulling burnt wires free, and rerouting power through emergency bypass lines. The Zarak watched with disbelief, unused to seeing a human work with such speed and boldness. Herco stepped into the room, the door hissing shut behind him as he barked updates more Croth ships were surrounding them. Shields had dropped to half strength, and the outer hull was starting to melt under the bombardment. Evan barely heard him. His entire mind was locked on the damaged systems before him, aware that any wrong move could turn the whole ship into a fireball. As he worked, another explosion rocked the ship, throwing several warriors to the ground. A support beam snapped and fell toward the cubs, but Evan lunged forward, grabbed the beam with both hands, and strained with all his strength until a warrior rushed over and pulled it aside. The cubs looked up at Evan with wide, trusting eyes, and that small moment gave him a burst of energy he didn't know he had left. He returned to the console and connected the final wire needed to stabilize the main reactor, and the lights flickered from red to blue for a moment, a sign that power was flowing again. But the victory was short-lived. A voice crackled through the comms, shouting that the Croth had launched boarding pods, and the ship shook again as enemy claws tore into the lower decks. Herco ordered defensive squads to intercept, but everyone knew they were outnumbered. Their warriors would soon be overwhelmed. Evan realized the energy system alone would not save them. He sprinted to the auxiliary panel, yanking open a metal hatch and sliding inside the cramped space, ignoring the heat biting at his skin. He crawled through the cables, cutting through dead ones, fusing new paths, and shouting instructions over his shoulder. The Zarek engineers followed them without hesitation, finally trusting the human who had proven himself again and again. As he worked, he shouted for a warrior to bring him a fusion stabilizer, and when it arrived, he slammed it into place just as the ship tilted dangerously from another Croth blast. The engines hummed louder, brighter, as if waking up from a deep sleep, and Harko looked around in disbelief as screens across the room lit up with power readings they had never reached in battle. The Zarek warriors stared at Evan with something new in their eyes, not just respect, but hope. The ship steadied, shields flickered back to life, and for the first time since the attack began, the Predator clan had a chance to fight back. But they also knew the Croth would not stop. More enemy ships were arriving each minute, surrounding them like a pack waiting to tear apart its prey. And as Evan climbed out of the crawl space, sweat dripping from his face, he looked at Harko and said with quiet certainty that if they wanted to survive, they would need to do something bold, something risky, something only humans were crazy enough to try. The Zarek flagship drifted in the middle of a battlefield that looked like a storm made of fire and metal. Surrounded on all sides by Croth warships whose dark hulls glowed with deadly plasma energy, and the air inside the Predator vessel grew heavy with the feeling that the end was closing in. Shields were failing again, warriors were exhausted, and the ship trembled each time an enemy blast hit its weakening armor. Evan stood in the engine room, breathing hard, his clothes soaked with sweat and streaks of oil, while the three cubs pressed against his legs, seeking comfort in his presence as the ship shook around them. Harko came to him with a grim look, the kind of expression a leader wore when he believed death was close but refused to show fear. He looked at the human with newfound respect, but he told him honestly that even with the repairs, the Zarek could not win in a direct fight. The Croth had too many ships, too many weapons, and no mercy. Evan took a long breath, staring at the reactor that hummed loudly like a beast ready to break free, and then he explained a plan that no Zarek warrior would have dared to imagine. It was wild, dangerous, and the kind of idea that could only come from a human who refused to give up even when the odds were impossible. He told Harko they could overload the damaged reactor on purpose, turning it into a burst of raw energy so bright and powerful that it would blind the Croth, tear apart their closest ships, and create a shock wave strong enough to push the Zarek vessel toward safety. But to survive the blast, they would have to time everything perfectly, activate a shield burst at the exact right moment, redirect all remaining power into the engines, and jump into warp space in the tiny window before the exploding energy consumed them. If they were too fast, the blast would catch them. If they were too slow, the ship would break apart. The room went quiet as everyone absorbed the plan. Warriors looked at each other in disbelief, engineers whispered nervously, and even the usually fierce Harko hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, the clan leader let out a low, rumbling laugh. He said the plan was insane, completely unreasonable, and very likely to kill them all, but it was the first idea that carried a real chance of survival. He placed a strong hand on Evan's shoulder, the gesture of a leader trusting another warrior, and told him to prepare everything. The crew rushed to their positions, shouting commands, locking in coordinates, and securing every system they still had control over. Evan worked quickly at the main console, typing commands, stabilizing the reactor just enough for it to explode the right way, and calling out numbers while the Zarek engineers copied his actions. The cubs watched him with wide eyes, sensing the danger but staying close, as if they already understood that he was their protector. Outside, the Croth ships moved into formation, ready to deliver the final blow, unaware of the light they were about to face. Evan shouted for the warriors to stand ready, and Harco gave the order to trigger the overload. The reactor roared like a living sun bursting open, flooding the ship with blinding white light. At the exact second the blast expanded outward, Harco slammed his fist onto the shield control, and the ship glowed with a thin bubble of energy. Evan yelled for the engine jump, and the vessel leaped forward as the explosion swallowed the battlefield. Enemy cruisers shattered in the wave, Croth cannons melted from the heat, and fire rolled across space like a rising dawn. The Zarak ship shot through the burning light, engines screaming, until finally it broke free and vanished into the safety of open space. For a moment, everything went silent inside the ship. No alarms, no shaking. Only the slow return of steady breathing as the crew realized they were alive. And in that quiet, the cubs climbed back into Evan's arms, purring in relief. And every warrior in the room knew their survival had been won by the courage of a human who refused to let them fall. As the days passed, the tension inside the camp grew like a heavy cloud that refused to move, and everyone could feel that something big was coming, even though no one wanted to speak about it. The young man woke up each morning with a tightness in his chest, unsure if it came from fear or the pressure of what he was learning. But he kept pushing himself forward because he knew there was no turning back anymore. His teacher watched him with sharp eyes, noticing how he had started to move faster, react quicker, and think with more focus, yet still reminding him that strength without control was nothing but danger waiting to explode. One evening, when the sky turned deep red and the shadows stretched long across the ground, the teacher called him to the training field where the air felt strangely silent, as if the world itself was waiting for something important to happen. The teacher told him that the real test was about to begin, not one with wooden targets or simple drills, but one built on instinct, courage, and the ability to stay calm when everything inside wanted to run or scream. Before the young man could ask questions, the ground shook softly beneath their feet, and a thick mist spilled across the field, hiding the trees and covering the ground with a silver blanket that made it hard to see anything clearly. The teacher stepped back and told him to enter the mist alone, explaining that this challenge would reveal who he truly was, not through words but through the choices he made and the fears he confronted. With his heartbeat thundering in his ears, the young man walked forward, feeling the cold air wrap around him like a warning, and soon the world behind him disappeared. Inside the mist, strange shapes moved quietly, sometimes appearing close, then fading away before he could understand what they were, and he felt both watched and tested by the unseen presence surrounding him. His breaths became short and sharp as memories tried to rise, painful moments he had buried, fears he had tried to ignore, doubts he never spoke of to anyone. But he forced himself to keep going, even when the ground seemed to tilt under his feet. The darkness inside the mist was not empty. It held his own thoughts, his own shadows, and at times he felt as if he was walking through the deepest corners of his mind. When a whisper brushed past his ear, he froze, unsure if it was real or imagined. But then he realized that the mist was not there to harm him, it was there to show him the truth about himself. He remembered his teacher's words about staying calm, so he closed his eyes for a moment and let the fear wash over him instead of fighting it. And slowly, something inside him loosened. When he opened his eyes again, the shadows no longer looked threatening. They looked like pieces of himself that he needed to accept. Step by step, he moved forward until the mist finally thinned and the warm light of the setting sun touched his face. His teacher stood waiting with a rare look of pride, telling him he had done what many failed to do. He had faced the storm inside his own heart. The young man felt a quiet strength settle inside him as he realized this challenge was not meant to break him but to prepare him for the battles ahead. Battles where fear and courage would walk side by side. and only those who understood themselves could survive what was coming.